Looking to switch careers? Let me tell you about the world's first truly terrible workplace, the pirate ship. Where quitting meant swimming with sharks, HR complaints were settled with swords, and your retirement plan was basically try not to die. And trust me, that's the good part. Speaking of terrible career choices, let's start with what might be the worst first job in history. Meet the powder monkey, a job for an 8-year-old kid whose daily routine involved dodging bullets while carrying explosives across a wooden death trap. And you thought your paper route was rough. This wasn't some fancy title either. These kids were literally running gunpowder to cannons while everyone around them tried to turn their ship into splinters. You know how parents today worry about their kids playing too many video games? Well, in the 1700s, they had to worry about little Timmy getting recruited to play a deadly game of hot potato with gunpowder barrels. These kids weren't exactly filling out job applications either. Most were orphans snatched off the streets or kids from poor families who couldn't afford to feed them. Pirates figured smaller targets were harder to hit, plus their tiny hands could squeeze through tight spaces to reach the powder magazines. During major naval battles, powder monkeys had a life expectancy of about 15 minutes once the fighting started. That's shorter than most coffee breaks. They had to navigate across decks that were literally being torn apart by cannon fire, carrying bags of extremely unstable gunpowder that could explode if a single spark landed on them. One wrong step, one stray bullet, or one hot piece of shrapnel. And, well, let's just say they didn't have workplace safety regulations back then. But wait, it gets better. These kids didn't even get combat training. Their entire job orientation consisted of run fast, don't trip, and try not to explode. That's it. No health insurance, no 401k, and definitely no hazard pay. The only bonus they might get was an extra helping of moldy biscuits if they survived their shift. Speaking of survival, you know who had to patch these kids up when things went wrong? The ship's surgeon, although calling him a surgeon is like calling a butcher a brain specialist, because these guys weren't exactly graduating from medical school. Most of them learned their trade by watching other amateur surgeons hack away at sailors, or worse, by practicing on prisoners. The survival rate for amputations back then was about 30%. That means if you needed your leg cut off, you had a better chance of dying than making it through the surgery. And that's assuming your surgeon wasn't 3 sheets to the wind on rum, which was surprisingly common. See, the rum wasn't just for the patient. Surgeons claimed it helped steady their hands. Yeah, right. Nothing says, trust me, I'm a professional, like your doctor taking a few swigs before grabbing his rusty saw. Let's talk about their medical toolkit. Modern surgeons have state-of-the-art equipment, sterilized tools, and fancy machines that go beep. Pirate surgeons had a saw, some fishing hooks for stitches, and maybe a hot iron if you were lucky. Their idea of anesthesia was a bottle of rum and a piece of leather to bite down on. If you ran out of rum, well, tough luck. Just bite harder. The most common antibiotics were gunpowder and vinegar rubbed into the wound, because apparently their motto was, if it doesn't kill you, it might cure you. Here's a fun fact. Some pirate surgeons actually kept logs of their procedures. One particularly honest fellow wrote, "Patient survived the operation by sheer stubbornness, clearly not due to any skill on my part." At least they had a sense of humor about their complete lack of qualifications. You might be wondering about their success rate with other procedures. Well, let's just say when a sailor saw the surgeon heading their way with his toolkit, they suddenly felt much better. Many would rather take their chances with whatever was wrong than face the surgeon's cure. Speaking of taking chances, you know who had the worst odds of all? The poor souls working down in the bilge. Those guys were literally swimming in... Well, you really don't want to know what they were swimming in? The bilge, where dreams went to die and rats went to party. Located at the lowest part of the ship, this wasn't just your average basement job. It was more like being assigned to work in a sewer that could kill you at any moment. The air down there was so toxic that sailors would draw straws to see who had to go down. Spoiler alert, nobody ever won that game. Let me paint you a nasty picture of what we're dealing with here. Everything that leaked, spilled, or rotted on the ship ended up in the bilge. That includes seawater, cargo juices, food waste, and yes, even human waste. The smell was so bad that first-timers would often pass out within minutes. The old sailors had a saying, if the smell doesn't knock you out, the rats will finish the job. Speaking of rats, these weren't your average street rats. These were muscled-up super rats that had evolved in the darkness of the bilge. They'd grown fat on the ship's waist and weren't afraid of anything. Some sailors swore they saw rats down there the size of cats, though that might have been the toxic fumes talking. The rats had one advantage, though. They could swim. Many bilge rats, the humankind, couldn't, which led to some pretty grim statistics. About 1 in every 20 bilge workers drowned in the filth they were supposed to be cleaning. The job itself was simple in theory. Use a bucket or pump to remove all the nasty water before it sank the ship. But try doing that in complete darkness, standing in knee-deep sludge, while fighting off territorial rats and trying not to breathe too deeply. Your only light source? A small lantern that could explode if it hit the wrong pocket of gases building up down there. Talk about a rough day at the office. But hey, at least the bilge rats had some job security. Nobody else wanted their job, and they got extra rum rations to help them forget what they'd seen down there. Though after a few months in the bilge, most of them probably wished they'd been part of the boarding party instead. The boarding party, or as I like to call them, the "why did I volunteer for this" crew. These weren't your typical party crashers showing up with snacks and drinks. They were more like the world's most aggressive door-to-door salesmen, except instead of selling vacuum cleaners, they were selling pure chaos with a side of violence. The job was simple. When your captain yelled, "Board them," you had to be the first one to jump onto the enemy ship. Just hop right over, surrounded by people actively trying to murder you. No pressure. If you refused, your own captain would shoot you. If you jumped, the enemy would try to shoot you. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Or in this case, between two very angry groups of pirates with guns. In the golden age of piracy, around 80% of first-wave boarding party members didn't make it past their third raid. The pirates actually had a betting system for new recruits. They'd wager on whether the new guy would make it or end up as fish food. The most common bet wasn't even about survival, but rather how many steps they'd take on the enemy ship before going down. The lucky ones who survived got promoted, which really just meant they got first dibs on the loot and a slightly better chance of survival in the next raid. Some clever pirates would tie ropes around their waists before jumping, not to prevent falling into the sea, but to make sure their crewmates could pull their body back if things went south. Talk about planning ahead. The best part of being in the boarding party? The pre-battle speech. Captains would try to pump up their boarding crews with inspiring words like, "Try not to die too quickly," or "If you survive this, drinks are on me." One famous pirate captain actually promised his boarding party they could have an extra serving of the ship's infamous mystery stew if they lived. Suddenly, death didn't seem like the worst option. At least these guys got to see some action before their untimely demise. The quartermaster, on the other hand, had to deal with an even worse fate, managing a crew full of these maniacs. Being a quartermaster on a pirate ship was like being a middle school principal, except your students were armed murderers who didn't believe in rules. These poor souls had to handle every single complaint, fight, and ridiculous demand from a crew of people who solved most of their problems with stabbing. It was basically HR from hell. The average pirate quartermaster dealt with about 50 disputes per week, ranging from "he stole my lucky eye patch" to "his parrot keeps insulting my mother." One famous log entry from 1716 reads, "Tuesday, had to settle an argument over whether mermaids count as fish for Friday dinner purposes. 3 stabbings before breakfast." You'd think pirates would be too busy pirating to argue about these things, but apparently not. Their job description was a nightmare. They had to distribute food and water rations, which meant telling hungry pirates they couldn't have seconds. They had to assign sleeping spots, which was like playing Tetris with angry cats. And worst of all, they had to handle the treasure distribution. Nothing starts a fight faster than telling a pirate they're getting a smaller share because they spent half the raid hiding in a barrel. They had to enforce the pirate code. Yes, pirates had rules, and someone had to make sure everyone followed them. One quartermaster kept a tally of how many times he heard, "But the code is more like guidelines." He gave up counting after reaching 1,000 in his first month. Here's a fun fact. Quartermasters were often elected by the crew, which means they actively volunteered for this nightmare. Talk about poor life choices. But the absolute worst duty? Breaking up fights over rum rations. One quartermaster wrote in his journal, "Would rather face the entire British Navy alone than tell Big Mike he's had enough rum for one night." The really skilled quartermasters developed a special technique. They'd start an even bigger argument about something else, then solve both problems while everyone was confused. At least the quartermaster could stay relatively safe inside the ship, unlike the poor helmsman who had to stand exposed on deck while everything around them exploded. Just turn the wheel, they said. It'll be easy, they said. Being a helmsman on a pirate ship was like trying to parallel park a building during an earthquake. These guys had to keep a massive wooden ship on course, while everything around them tried to make that impossible. The fun part? They couldn't leave their post even if the ship was literally falling apart around them. Some helmsmen took this job so seriously that they'd actually nail their hands to the wheel during battles. Yes, you read that right. They hammered actual nails through their palms into the wheel. This wasn't some weird pirate fashion statement. It was their way of making sure they wouldn't abandon the helm even if they passed out from blood loss or fear. According to ship logs from the 1700s, about 1 in every 10 helmsmen had permanent scars on their hands from this practice. The job came with some unique occupational hazards. While everyone else could duck behind something when the bullets started flying, the helmsman had to stand there like a target in a carnival game. The wheel was usually on the highest deck, completely exposed, making the helmsman an easy target for enemy snipers. Their survival rate in major battles was so low that some ships started putting up wooden dummies next to the real helmsman to confuse enemy shooters. The captain would be screaming orders like, "Turn harder," or "Make the ship go faster," as if the helmsman had magical powers to change the wind direction or make the sea less choppy. One helmsman's diary entry reads, "Captain asked me to make the ship dance a jig today. Told him I left my magic wand in my other pants. Now I'm on latrine duty for a week." But the absolute worst part? If anything went wrong, running aground, hitting a reef, or just sailing into a storm, guess who got blamed? That's right, the guy who was just following orders. It's like blaming your GPS for taking you to the wrong address, except instead of a bad review, you might get thrown overboard. Speaking of being thrown overboard, at least the helmsmen chose their job. The pressed crewmen didn't even get that luxury. They just woke up one morning and surprised. They were pirates now. Their job interview consisted of getting knocked out at a bar and waking up in the middle of the ocean. Welcome aboard. Here's your complimentary sword and a lifetime supply of regret. The practice was called impressment, but it was basically kidnapping with extra steps. Records show that in the early 1700s, nearly 40% of pirate crews were made up of these unwilling recruits. Pirates would raid port towns, not just for treasure, but for fresh bodies to fill their crews. Their recruiting strategy? Hit someone over the head hard enough to knock them out, but not so hard they couldn't work tomorrow. It was a delicate balance. Training for pressed crewmen went something like this. Here's a sword. That end goes in the other guy. Don't stab yourself. Also, we sail in 10 minutes. Some of these guys had never even seen a ship before, let alone worked on one. Sailors actually had a betting pool for how long the new guys would last before falling overboard. The record was 12 minutes. Poor Gary from Manchester didn't even make it past the dock. Pirates had their own version of a company orientation. Instead of getting a tour of the office and meeting your coworkers, you got threats about what would happen if you tried to escape. One captain's welcome speech went, "If you run, you'll drown. If you fight back, you'll be shot. If you work hard, you might get dinner. Welcome to the family." Historical records show that even the infamous Blackbeard used this recruitment method. He was known to say that unwilling crew members made the best pirates because they had something to prove. Though personally, I think they just worked harder because they were terrified of becoming the ship's whipping boy. And trust me, that was definitely not a promotion. The whipping boy, basically the punching bag of the high seas. While everyone else on the ship at least pretended to have a real job, this poor soul's entire purpose was to be a human stress ball for the captain. Bad weather? Whip the boy. Lost a battle? Whip the boy. Captain stubbed his toe? You better believe that's a whipping. The job came with some interesting perks, like having the longest medical record on the ship. One ship's log from 1723 shows that their whipping boy received 147 lashes in a single month, just because the captain's favorite parrot died. The cause of death? The parrot had flown into a cannon during battle. Somehow, this was apparently the whipping boy's fault. Makes total sense, right? Ships back then had something called punishment menus, different types of torture for different offenses. There was keel hauling, where they dragged you under the ship until you either drowned or got shredded by barnacles. The cat o' nine tails was another favorite, a whip with 9 separate leather strands, each with knots tied in them. And let's not forget the classic dance the hempen jig, which was just a fancy way of saying, we're going to hang you from the yardarm. The really twisted part is that some captains actually believed having a whipping boy brought good luck to the ship. They thought the more the whipping boy suffered, the more fortune would smile upon them. Historical records show one captain who made his whipping boy wear a special red shirt so the bloodstains wouldn't show and ruin everyone's appetite at dinner. How thoughtful of him. But the absolute worst part of being the whipping boy? Everyone else blamed you for their problems too. Ship's cook burned the food? Must be because the whipping boy didn't get punished enough that morning. Storm approaching? Quick, whip the boy before it gets worse. It was like being the only tech-savvy person in your family. Everything that goes wrong is somehow your fault. At least the whipping boy got to stay alive, though, unlike the poor soul who had to handle the dead bodies. Now that guy had some seriously stiff competition for the worst job on the ship. The corpse handler had a pretty straightforward job description: deal with the dead. But in the world of superstitious pirates, nothing was ever that simple. You couldn't just toss bodies overboard. Oh no, that would anger the sea gods. You had to follow a whole ritual, or the ghost might come back and haunt the ship. Because apparently, regular pirate life wasn't scary enough. According to ship logs from the 1700s, corpse handlers had to follow strict rules. The body had to be sewn into a shroud, weighted with cannonballs, and sent off at sunset. Never at night, because night ghosts were extra spooky. Some handlers would stitch the last few stitches through the dead person's nose just to make sure they weren't just deeply asleep. Talk about a wake-up call. It all started during big battles when bodies would pile up faster than a medieval plague. The corpse handler had about 6 hours in the tropical heat before things got really nasty. And by nasty, I mean the kind of smell that could knock out a skunk. One handler wrote in his diary, "Today, I learned that dead pirates smell worse than live ones. Didn't think that was possible." Some captains had the brilliant idea of using dead bodies as psychological warfare. They'd order the corpse handler to lash enemy bodies to the front of the ship as a warning to others. This meant the poor handler had to eat, sleep, and work with decomposing bodies as roommates. One handler reportedly asked for a raise and got this response: "Your co-workers are dead silent and never complain. You should learn from them." But the absolute worst part of the job is that pirates believed that if you didn't handle a body properly, its ghost would haunt you personally. Handlers would often sleep with garlic and silver crosses just in case. Some would even apologize to the bodies as they worked, saying things like, "Sorry about the nose stitch, mate, but better safe than sorry." At least the corpse handler got to work with quiet customers. The ship's cook had to deal with living, breathing, constantly complaining pirates who all thought they were food critics. If you thought your cafeteria food was bad, try being a pirate ship cook. These guys had to turn the most disgusting ingredients into something edible or face a mob of hangry pirates with sharp objects. Their daily specials included such delicacies as maggoty biscuits, leather-tough salt pork, and when things got really bad, authentic sea rat stew. The ship's biscuits were so hard that pirates actually had to soak them in their beer just to avoid breaking their teeth. And here's the really appetizing part. These biscuits were usually full of weevils, tiny bugs that made themselves at home in the flour. The cooks had a special technique for dealing with this. They'd wait until it was dark to serve the biscuits so no one could see what was crawling around in their food. One cook's diary from 1725 reads, "Today, a sailor complained about extra protein in his biscuit. Told him it was a new exotic spice. He asked for seconds." Food storage was a complete nightmare. The average pirate ship stored food for 6 months at a time, but they didn't exactly have refrigerators. Meat was preserved in so much salt, it was practically mummified, and vegetables. Well, let's just say the term fresh produce didn't exist in a pirate cook's vocabulary. Statistics show that about 50% of a ship's food supply would be rotten or spoiled by the halfway point of a journey. During really tough times, things got dark, literally and figuratively. There are actual records of pirate cooks having to serve mystery meat during long voyages. One famous story tells of a cook who served what he claimed was exotic island pork during a particularly rough month at sea. It wasn't until weeks later that the crew realized they were short a few crew members. That's right, some pirate ships had their own version of a secret recipe, and trust me, you didn't want to know the ingredients. The most successful pirate cooks weren't necessarily good at cooking. They were good at lying about what they were cooking. No, that's not a rat tail in your stew, it's an exotic noodle. The green fuzzy stuff on your bread? That's expensive French cheese. That moving thing in your soup? Just some very fresh seafood. And there you have it. The 10 absolute worst jobs you could have on a pirate ship. Makes your 9 to 5 look pretty good now, doesn't it?